Jerry Mintz has been a leading voice in the alternative school movement for over 30 years. In addition to his 17 years as a public and independent alternative school principal and teacher, he has also helped to found more than 100 public and private alternative schools and organizations. He has lectured and consulted in more than 25 countries around the world. In 1989, Jerry launched the Alternative Education Resource Organization, otherwise known as AERO, and since then has served as its director. He is also the author of the 2017 book, School's Over: How to Have Freedom and Democracy in Education. Jerry Mintz, welcome to the Liberated podcast.
Well, nice to be here, wherever we are.
It's so great to have you here. I mean, you are just such a pioneer in the world of alternative education. And AERO, the Alternative Education Resource Organization that you founded, of course, has been a gateway for so many individuals, many of them conventional teachers who entered the classroom and realized that there might be something more and better and different, and then found their way to AERO. So you've been just such a great resource, both personally and through the organization, to really encourage educators to explore alternative education, as well as through AERO's School Starter program to help them launch their own schools. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about your background, kind of in the beginning of your journey, what got you into education, and then specifically alternative education. What was that pathway for you?
Well, you can go back and back and back, but when I really trace this properly, I go all the way back to when I was a little kid and used to go visit my grandfather, who was a brilliant Renaissance man. And he was a lawyer and a judge and lived in Boston. And we would go there and he would sit down with me and say, "So, what do you want to learn?" So that was my paradigm for education. And we talked about everything from Freud's ego, id, and superego, and agnosticism and atheism and religious approaches and things like that when I was just 6, 7, 8 years old. Theories of humor, causes of the World War II. And so the whole point is that that's what I felt should be the paradigm for education, but it wasn't. And when I found that out, I decided to try to change that. So the rest is history, so to speak. Not yet. We're working on it.
And so you spent, as you said, 17 years as a classroom teacher and administrator. What led you to create AERO in 1989 from that experience in the classroom?
Well, I think that I wasn't satisfied with just having a nice little school. I wanted to see this go beyond that. And so what I wanted to see was the possibility of a learner-centered approach to education for everybody, for all students everywhere. And so this is the mission of AERO. And after 30 years of doing this, it's still the mission of AERO. We've made some progress. Yes, as you said, we started a lot of little schools. We don't know how many, because some people just go to our website and take what they want and go and start their schools. So, or programs or whatever, it's not schools. Really, a lot of it is homeschool resource centers now. And so we think this may have had some impact on what happened during the pandemic, in the sense that there were little examples of this all over the world. And so when they couldn't have regular school, some people reached out for that approach. And so distance learning and what they called pandemic pods, which are really homeschool resource centers, so on, all came about. And I think maybe it helped a little bit that we had some models out there.
And so what does alternative education mean to you, Jerry? I mean, what are the kinds of educational models, schools, homeschool resource centers, et cetera, that you're supporting? What do they have in common?
Well, as I said, they're learner-centered in their approach rather than curriculum-driven. So they don't start with the idea of, well, we know all the answers, we're going to force feed them to you, you're going to spit them back to us, and then you're ready for life. There may have been a time when that was true, but it certainly hasn't been true for a long, long time.
And there's quite a variety within that kind of learner-centered umbrella, or underneath that umbrella. You know, you have educational models represented through AERO of democratic schools, Sudbury model schools, Montessori schools, other sort of independent progressive schools. And as you mentioned, the wide variety of educational approaches we see under homeschooling and through homeschooling resource centers. Was that always intentional for you to have this sort of big tent organization?
Yes, it was. Even though my personal background is in democratic education, I felt that this universe was bigger than that, of people who understood the idea of a learner-centered education. And the edges sometimes get a little questionable, but that's generally the approach that we have always taken, to try to get a variety of people involved and learning from each other and so on.
So tell us a little bit more about democratic education. You said that was where your background was. That's very much a part of the Sudbury model of education, but doesn't have to be. There's other sort of democratic models. And for my listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with that, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what that means.
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Democratic education means that the students have a vote, actually, not just to say, but very often an actual vote in what their school's decisions are going to be, and to make decisions about their own learning. So that's really what it comes down to. And to me, in a way, some people say, well, we're somewhat democratic. I don't think you can be a little pregnant, and in that sense. If you're not democratic, okay, you're not democratic. You may be progressive, like John Dewey's approaches and Montessori's and so on, where there's still the feeling of they know what the right thing is ultimately. So with true democratic education, really, it could go anywhere. And you never know what's going to happen. And this curriculum isn't necessarily set in stone at all. For example, I remember once at my school, one of the kids came into school one day and he said, I'd like to know what I have to do to get a pilot license. And so I said, okay, whoever's interested in Danny's pilot's license class, get in the van. And so we said, well, let's see, where are we going? Let's go to the airport. So we drove to the airport, and they said, oh yeah, there's a place next door to here where they train pilots. You might want to go talk to them. So we drove over there, we went in, and we were talking to the guy, and he was explaining the things that are necessary. And then one of the pilots came in and he said, oh, why don't you show him the inside of the plane, show him the dash and everything. So we went into the plane, and the guy said, why don't you take him for a spin? And we wound up flying over our school. So that was definitely not something that we had any concept would happen before that day started.
It's such a great example, because I think sometimes when people hear the term democratic education, or students having a say in the governance of their schools, they think, oh, well, my kid goes to a school that has a student council and they're able to, make some votes here and there. But that's not at all what we mean by democratic education, right? It's really being much more involved in the overall operations of the school, of the program, and really having those learner interests and passions drive the education, not have something imposed on them from adults.
It's really kind of necessary. It's really necessary for you to believe that children are natural learners. If you understand that, you can't really use the other approach because it actually is counterproductive. It tends to diminish the actual ability to learn. The more you force children or people to learn things they're not interested in, the worse it is in terms of ability to learn. And so there are some amazing stories about unschoolers, homeschooling that takes an approach that basically builds on the interest of the learner and what they have been able to do, because the natural rate of learning is so much higher than what is in school. People don't realize that. For example, there was a student who was interning for us, and at one point he decided that there was an opportunity to go back to home and take college classes. But in order to do that, he had to pass a test. And one of them had algebra on it, and he'd never studied algebra. So what did he do? Well, he taught himself algebra in 1 week to the point where he could even teach other people, aced the test, and went to the college. So this is what happens when students unschool. They can learn at pretty astronomical, that would be what, 50 times faster?
Yeah, when they're ready and interested, right? I mean, this is sort of the beauty of self-directed, non-coercive education that's very much captured by unschooling methods and democratic and Sudbury model schooling. Right, that really places the learner in charge of their own education and has faith that they will, in fact, learn what they need to know when they need to know it, and in the ways that are most meaningful to them and most useful. So, Jerry, you founded AERO in 1989. Again, such a wonderful resource called educationrevolution.org is the website. What have you seen over the past, well, now more than 3 decades since founding AERO in terms of the climate for alternative education? What have been some of the trends or cycles that you've noticed during that time?
Well, progress has been made. So there are many places in which students can choose an alternative school. But the system itself remains pretty intractable. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? And there's no easy answers. One is it's what teachers are used to. It's how they were trained. And another is that there is an interest in keeping control of students and not really letting them become totally independent thinkers, that could rock the boat, you see. So those are a couple of ideas about why this may be the case. But there are not very many examples of places where democratic education can be in a public school. Israel is about the only one. And in Israel, and that's changing and getting worse, I hear, but still, starting with Yaakov Hecht's Democratic School of Hadera in the 80s, there are now maybe 25 public democratic schools in Israel, and so everybody in Israel knows what a democratic school is. Here in the United States, there are a few that kind of are in that direction, but they're still kind of controlled by the system. On the other hand, for the most part, AERO has felt that change is not going to come from within the system, that it's important to set up totally independent models outside of the system. And that's most of what we do. We do help people start public alternatives. A good example is Ridge and Valley, which is in New Jersey. It's a charter school, which are public schools. They're publicly funded. And I think they're something like 30 years old now. And we were involved, I think, in trying to help them in the beginning. There's a person that I worked with back then who's still running the school. And she helped me do my first book on the alternative education. It was a directory of alternative schools. So there's been progress, but we have a long way to go.
We have a long way to go, and you touched on this a little bit before when we talked about kind of the education disruption caused by COVID, that more and more people recognized the value of these learning pods, which were called pandemic pods, and we of course might call them homeschool co-ops or other kind of co-learning communities. So more awareness was brought to the different ways that education can look, and maybe more interest in it, in alternative education specifically from that. Are you optimistic about the future of alternative education, or where do you see, I suppose, alternative education going over the next 30 years?
Well, it's interesting. We don't know. We always like to see instant change, but we don't know where the pandemic experience is going. But 2 billion people around the world all of a sudden discovered that they weren't necessarily tied to their local assigned school. So that was a big revelation. What's interesting is homeschooling has tripled since then, but homeschooling by people of color has maybe gone up 5 times. It's still not huge numbers, but it's over 10%. And why did this happen? Well, because I always wondered why there weren't more minority people homeschooling, because of institutional racism. And they didn't necessarily understand they had that choice, and now they do. So there is a change that's taking place. We don't know where it's going, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that 5-fold increase in the number of Black homeschooling families. The U.S. Census Bureau in 2021 discovered that there had been that dramatic rise in the number of Black homeschooling families, to the point where Black homeschoolers were overrepresented in the homeschool population compared to their representation in the overall K-12 public school population. So more more Black homeschoolers than again Black students in the overall general school population. So definitely some growth there. And I think you're right. It'll be interesting to see the continued diversification and growth of homeschooling, which was of course happening pre-2022 and has, I think, just been accelerated. And so, Jerry, the annual AERO conference is happening in person this June. I believe it's the first in-person conference since COVID. You were running some virtual programs over the past few years. And this one will be held June 23rd to 25th at Long Island University in Long Island, New York. There will also be a virtual component to it as well. And so people can sign up or register for either the in-person or the virtual. I'm looking forward to giving a presentation in the in-person conference in Long Island, and hope to see many of my listeners and viewers there. But who should register for the AERO conference? Who is it intended for?
Well, anybody who wants to see more learner-centered education should go. So that would include teachers, administrators, parents, and students. And there are a lot of students that do go to this conference, and they usually have quite an impact on it and are sometimes presenters. And we, since actually during COVID, we had a lot of students that took responsibility for whole conferences even. The last one was completely run by students. And so we hope that a lot of people do come. This is the first in-person one. We tried during the COVID to have the interactive aspect, the networking that is crucial to AERO, to be part of it. And we did to some extent, but there's no way to replace what happens at an in-person AERO conference. It's really pretty magical. And And I'd say it was unique in the sense that I don't know of another conference that works that way and has quite that power.
I think you're right. It really is magical. I've talked to many education entrepreneurs, including those who've been on this podcast, who've said that it was really attending their first AERO conference that gave them the confidence, the community, the real catalyst to go off and create their own school that was focused around kind of learner-centered education. And so it's just tremendous to see the impact that not only AERO has as an organization through your newsletter and other, resources, the school starter program, but especially this kind of flagship AERO conference. And I'm glad you mentioned youth involvement in the conference too. My older daughter has presented at AERO conferences in the past. She'll be with me again in Long Island this spring, or this summer, I guess, June 23rd to 25th. And you do try to put panels together of youths who learn in these kinds of alternative education environments and get their reflections and responses. So that's something else I think that sets AERO apart from other conferences. And so, Jerry, I'd love to just kind of get your overall thoughts about American education more generally. Obviously, AERO is a global organization. You have members all around the world, but I'd love to hear specifically what your thoughts are with American education, the trends that you expect to see in kind of U.S. education models, and maybe do you think that alternative education models will continue to have a greater and greater impact or percentage when we think about education more generally?
Well, I think that this approach to education makes more sense to students. When parents see it, they're happy to see the changes in their kids. I think it has become much, much more urgent lately. It seems like partly a result of the pandemic, but some of this was happening before. The depression and suicide rates and all that with kids, this wasn't really as bad as it seems to be getting. It's really only dawning on me that there's been a fairly dramatic change. And so the need for what we're doing is much more urgent. I wonder if there's been research done on, for example, alternative schools, democratic schools, alternative schools compared to mainstream schools in terms of depression and suicide and all of this stuff, because I'm observationally, we know that it doesn't, it's not a problem, but it would be good to have research done, and then people could realize, hey, wait, this approach is going to kill our kids. They need to understand that.
I think there is that sense of urgency now, and combined with the growth that certainly I'm seeing, and I hope you are too, in more of these alternative education models, community-based, kind of bottom-up, micro schools and learning pods and homeschool programs. I'm confident that we'll see more and more options for families, and that hopefully it will lead to some change within the system. But I agree with you that I think most of the change will come out of the system, and it's organizations like AERO that really provide those resources and that encouragement for education entrepreneurs and teachers working in classrooms to make that change. So, Jerry, just to wrap up, if my viewers and listeners go to the AERO website, educationrevolution.org, what will they find there and what should they do?
Well, there are a lot of resources there. They can, for example, look at our member schools list, or under the section of Find a School, and find a local school to visit, to teach in, to send your kids to, and so on. So that's just one example of the kind of resources that are there. There are a lot of articles about this, democratic governance, all that sort of thing. And so you can learn a lot just by going there. And then underneath the educationrevolution.org is aeroconference.org. And you can go directly there and see what's actually scheduled to this point at the AERO conference. and there's a lot more to come. We've just opened up registration at an early bird rate. It's very inexpensive. And I mean, ultimately it'll be about 195 for the 3 days, and now it's going to be it's 140 the early bird rate, and the same thing is true. There are special rates for those going virtually, because we had so many other people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to go to a conference coming when we were virtual. A lot of those people have said, hey, we want to keep on doing this. So that's why we're going to, for the first time, try to do a hybrid event. And we haven't done it before, so it's going to be interesting to see if it works.
So great. And folks can sign up for the AERO newsletter and stay connected with your work as well.
The AERO newsletter is free, goes to about 15,000 people around the world who are involved with educational alternatives. And you can sign up for it on any major page of the main website.
Jerry Mintz, thank you for your path-breaking work in supporting and encouraging alternative education. And thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
And I look forward to seeing you in person at the AERO conference.
Me too. Looking forward to that. Thanks, Jerry.
All right, take care.